I think I actually was able to figure out the mic this time and unmuted myself. So the mic wasn't the problem, it was me last week or 2 weeks ago. Thank you for all being here. As you know, Greg's out of town, so he asked me to take the class again on Acts. We're going to be studying primarily in the 27th chapter, if you'd like to turn there, Acts 27. Well, we're going to be in 26 and verse 28. We ended there last week speaking about the trial before Festus and Agrippa. So Paul was once again on trial. Festus was in a predicament because Paul had not been released as his innocence would have required, but was kept and was almost forced to go back to Jerusalem to stand trial again, even though no guilt was found in him. So he appealed to Caesar. And so Festus is having problems writing to his Lord, writing to Caesar and explaining the charges against him and why he's bothering the emperor at this time. So Agrippa shows up, and Agrippa is one that might be able to tell a little bit more about the situation because he is an Idumean, he rules over the area. He most likely had a Jewish education of some sorts, and some of the family the Herod family actually converted to Judaism. So he might be able to understand some of the issues between Paul and the Jews. Paul makes his defense not in the same way. He started the same way. I'm not guilty of any of the charges and they can't prove it, but he ended up preaching a sermon to them. He knew Agrippa was one who might have background in the scriptures, and he tried to convince him. And at the very end, in verse 28 of chapter 26, we see, I'll start. Well, it's going to be 28 in just a moment. Oh, maybe I'm back. Let me go back one. Well, maybe my slide's going to start at 30, but in your Bible, go to 28. So, King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do. Agrippa replied to Paul, in a short time, I'm reading from the New American Standard, in a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian. And we talked about this a little bit last time. The King James Version says, almost you persuaded me to become a Christian. So those translators in King James Version seem to be like he's maybe closer to possibly making a step. You know, he was thinking about it in some way. But we see from the account that nothing ever happened. And so the lesson we learn from that is, almost is not enough, just as the song tells us. The translators of the New American Standard come up with a different thought. He says, really, in a way, he says, within such a short time, do you really expect me to become a Christian? That's kind of the thought that these translators put forth in the New American Standard. And we see the response of Paul here in the next verse. In verse 29 it says, and Paul said, I wish to God that whether in a short or a long time, not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as am I, except for these chains. So Paul takes the opportunity, even before kings, even vassal kings or governors or anybody, or just his fellow Jew, to teach them about Christ, right? Try to convince them. And he has no reservations about giving the gospel to anyone. And he wishes that everyone in that room, not only the nobility, but even the servants that are there or the guards that are there, might one day name the name of Christ and become as he, not in chains, but a free man from sin. And so we see the desire of Paul for all men to be saved. We see even that here at this time. But the next couple of verses, next three verses that are on the board, and notes that the king stood up, and the governor and Bernice and those who were sitting with him, and when they had gone aside, they began talking to one another, saying, this man is not doing anything worthy of death or imprisonment. And Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. So the time the gospel was presented to them, they made no choosing the right path, right? They got up and they left and they did nothing. But at least Agrippa was realizing that you're still in trouble, Festus, because this man has no guilt. And if he hadn't have called or appealed to Caesar, he would have been set free. We don't know that because he had been shown as no guilt for multiple years and had not been set free. But Agrippa will not be able to help him in his predicament of explaining to his Lord the problem that exists here. So, anybody have any questions about or comments about these verses before we move into chapter 27? Seeing none, we'll move on. I'm going to, at one point, get this right. Okay, so verse 1. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some of the other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in an, I'm not going to get this right, Adramyttian, I think that's how you pronounce it, ship, which was about to sail for the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. So there was some time that elapsed, and there was a decision to set sail for Italy. And so Paul, along with some of the others that were going to Italy, possibly for the same reason, were given over to a commander or centurion of the name Julius. It notes being of the Augustan cohort. Augustan cohort, and a cohort is a leader of about 600, or a cohort is about 600 men normally. The Augustan adjective here, Augustus was the first emperor. Octavian was his original name. Augustus was what it was changed to later. This was a sign of honor, it appears like, given to soldiers or groups of soldiers that had done very well. And so they gave him the Augustan name. At least that's what some of the commentators state. So this is a special group of soldiers. And they were going on an Adramyttian ship. And we'll see on the map in just a moment where that is. It's a town in Mysia. We also see the pronoun we again. So for a period of time, we haven't seen that occur. Why? Who would represent the we here that we're talking about? Monty.
I think it includes Luke. He's the writer of the book. And so he was in Paul's company, so it's at least him and Paul, and it mentions another guy, Aristarchus, was with them. So there's at least that many in that group that were accompanying Paul on his journey to Italy.
Yeah, very right. On the way back on his last journey, we see that Luke had joined him again on his way back to Jerusalem. He was with him. We saw him even on those trips. We don't hear of him for the past couple of years because Paul's in prison, and it's speaking in the first person when Paul is talking. But we see him joining him on the trip, and also Aristarchus. We've seen Aristarchus a couple of times before. In Acts the 19th chapter, and in verse 29, I believe that's the first time that we see him. Acts 19:29. They are in Ephesus, and there is a problem going on, right? There was a riot that was occurring because of the silversmiths, and they were wanting somebody to, whip on for a little while, and Aristarchus was there with Paul. So Acts 19 and 29, it states, let me find it. The city was filled with confusion. They rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. So when he had traveled through Macedonia, he had picked up at Thessalonica Aristarchus, and he had traveled with him later on. He was in Ephesus during this time, and he was one that was about to really be torn to bits here because of the riots, and Paul wasn't the one that they had grabbed. They knew these people were with him, and they chose to grab them, Gaius and Aristarchus. Later on, we see Aristarchus mentioned in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10. Colossians 4 and verse 10. Colossians is one of the prison epistles that we know that Saul wrote while in prison. And it mentions that in chapter 4, verse 10 of Colossians, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, sends you his greetings, and also Barnabas's cousin Mark. So we see here, and I don't know at this time whether Aristarchus was a free man or one of the prisoners, but ultimately he was a prisoner with Paul during his journey to Rome. So we have a very faithful servant of God and servant of Paul along this journey with him. All right, and verses 3 through 6. Any questions or comments on those first couple of verses? If not, verses 3 through 6. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go on to his friends and receive care. From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. When we had sailed to the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra and Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us on board it. So we see, in just a moment I'll show a map, but Sidon's just north of Caesarea. That's there they stopped off, and Paul was able to receive care from his friends, and it's an assumption we make that these friends are probably Christians. The Jews that were his friends previously aren't very friendly to him now. And it's interesting because the last time we hear of Sidon, at least probably, is when Jesus is pronouncing woes upon Chorazin and Bethsaida, cities of Jerusalem. And those cities of Jerusalem are saying, he was saying, woe to you, these Jewish cities, if Sidon and Tyre had heard or seen these miracles and heard the message, they would have repented. But you didn't. And so Sidon and Tyre are made to be, sinful cities at that point that hadn't heard of the message. And we can almost make an assumption here that ultimately that message did make it to Sidon, right? And we probably have Christians there as well. So we see the power of the gospel even to those who were once called sinners or compared to as sinners, that they can become saved as well. Wade.
That they encountered this strong headwind. You kind of wonder where that headwind came from. God is God directing the ship to kind of go where He wants it to go, so He can influence Paul's journey.
Yeah, we're not told. Sometime in this journey, we're told God has done certain things, or will provide certain paths of escape. We don't know. It could be providence that He's making it up along these coasts or seeing these people. It very well could be providence. We're not. If we're told, then probably we don't know. But we'll see this headwind quite a few times before our study ends. Alexandrian ship. So later on we see that they leave the Adramyttian ship and gain an Alexandrian ship. So at that time, and even today, there's the Nile Delta, right? And Alexandria was at the northern part of Africa, and it was known, Egypt was known for all of their fertile land and that they could grow grain. And so many ships, we'll see later on what the ship is filled with, it's filled with wheat or wheat products, and they were known for being abundant in that. And so this ship was on its way to Rome. We don't know whether it was knocked off course because of these winds that were causing problems for Paul, but they could just go along the ports, the Roman ports, and drop off their wheat there as well. But we see that's who they gain admittance to the Alexandrian ship for sailing to Italy, and they're put aboard that. I'm going to walk over there and get there is a little pen that I want to use to draw where we're going on this, and I left it over here in my bag, so I'll just take it. So here's a map, so we can draw where we're going on the map, or where we've been and where we're going, and mine is super small now that I have my notes on here. But we start with Caesarea. Oh, it got bigger. Caesarea, and we came up to Sidon. And because of the winds, they had to go around to the north side of Cyprus. And they sailed under Cilicia, Pamphylia, come to Myra. I believe that's where we are right now. Normally, you would have gone south of Cyprus if the winds were cooperative. So that is where we're at the present time. Any comments or questions so far? All right, we're going to have a lot of sailing difficulty for the next few verses. So starting in verse 7. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty had arrived at Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete, off Simon, and with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. So here's a little bit, sorry, it's a different color map. I'm going to zoomed in a little bit from where we once were. Let me go back. So we had made it all the way to Myra. They sailed to Cnidus, and they were trying to have Crete as a cover. They sailed past Salmon, Lasea, to Fair Havens, right here. So we've made it all the way under Greece, or Achaia, is where we're at this present time. Okay, in verse 9, we'll continue. When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and of the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. So we see considerable time had passed. The voyage was now dangerous. And it talks about a fast here. And I believe the commentators all agree that this fast was associated with the Day of Atonement. It was in the 7th or the 8th month of the Jewish calendar, which was closer to October, November of our calendar. And really, at that time, in this area, you pretty much did not sail after October. It was not a good thing to do. It was not wise because of the storms that would occur during that time of year. And so you would winter in whatever harbor you could get to that was a good harbor. And so Paul here, he says, Men, I perceive. And we'll notice that later on that there's sometimes Paul perceives things, and then sometimes Paul gives the credit to God for giving him the information. We don't know for sure whether God provided him this information, but it seems like Paul was just giving his opinion about what might happen here. He says, if we keep going, there could be a lot of problems. It could even cost us our lives if we continue. Not only the ship and whatever is in it, the valuable things here, but something much more valuable is each and every person that's on it. But, so we have a prisoner, a Jewish prisoner, and he's given advice. And the centurion, who is ultimately over the ship, there's a captain of the ship and a pilot, but when a centurion gains board, he is now the commander of the ship and can give orders to whoever he wishes and give direction. So the centurion has to make a decision. Do I listen to Paul, this prisoner, or do I listen to the captain of the ship and a pilot? And we'll see that he listens to the pilot. So why would he listen to Paul? And why would Paul have any direct knowledge of anything to do with the sea? Monty?
I've always thought it interesting that here's a prisoner on the ship is actually getting input in the council that they're having about where they're going to go or when they're going to do it. To me, if I had a prisoner, he'd be off in the galley somewhere. Wherever you put prisoners, he wouldn't have been in amongst that to begin with. So I've always thought it was interesting that he was even allowed that. So when he talked previously about how he was treated kindly and allowed to have the liberty to go visit his friends, Paul was just nominally a prisoner. I mean, he wasn't like he was bound up in chains. He had a lot of freedom, and apparently in his interaction with them from day to day, he gained a lot of respect by it and was able to influence things to some degree.
And we'll see ultimately by the end of the voyage, he has a lot of respect gained. I mean, when things come to pass that you advise them against, you obviously gain acceptance by them. But it is odd to note that he is even being listened to in some way. Paul is not a normal prisoner. There were prisoners on board, and we don't know that they received the same treatment as Paul did. But all throughout his imprisonment, he was treated not as a hard, fast criminal, but as one that would be allowed freedoms even during his imprisonment. And I put this on the board. You probably can't see it very well, but these are the journeys that Paul went on. And the fourth one, so take out the red one, because he's on that one now, but he's been on the sea a lot, right? He spent a lot of time sailing around, so he has experience. So it's not like some guy that's read a book. You know, we know those people that know everything about everything because they've read it or seen a YouTube video about it, and they can just tell you, give you their advice. But he has firsthand experience because all of the time he spent years traveling around, and a lot of times some of them were walking, some of them were on a boat. A lot of them were on a boat, as you can see, with all of those arrows going back and forth. So Paul has experience, right? And we'll see later on that they start to listen to him. Okay, going on to verse 12. Anybody have any comments before we move on? Okay. Because the harbor, if we think back to Fair Havens, because the harbor at Fair Havens was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor on Crete facing the southwest and north, and spend the winter there. So this wasn't the best place to park for the winter, right? It wasn't suitable for wintering. But they'll find in a minute, I think, that any place was more suitable than what they'll be in for the next month, we think. So I think Paul's advice obviously would have been better to be heeded at this point in time. But there was something better about Phoenix, and Phoenix was off to the north, so there's probably 75 miles up into the northwest of where Fair Havens was. So it wasn't just I'm going to row my boat, a couple of yards down the river. They had a good trek to go. Wade?
I was just kind of looking at the green lines on the map. And so if you kind of compare, we're probably around Virginia or Pennsylvania is on the United States. That's probably about where they were.
Right.
Maybe a little north of there, but they were right in that area. So I mean, they would get a good winter.
Right. Oh, yeah, they would. And you think we'll talk about the storms that occur there too. We'll maybe compare them to some of the storms that side of the northeastern part of the United States gets too, because that's the kind of storm they're going to face in just a moment. So they're trying to get around to the northwest side of the island because there's a better area to winter there, to pull up the boat, to take it out of the water a little bit. And then all of a sudden in verse 12, everything seems to be working out, right? So with a moderate south wind, that's where they needed to go. They needed to stay close to the island. They were south of the island. They needed to stay south and then go north. So they needed a south wind. Came up, supposing that they had gained their purpose. So this, we were right. We have made the right decision. So they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete close inshore. We'll find, these little things that we see sometimes. Maybe we think, oh, I made the right decision, right? Or I'm maybe going against good advice that somebody's given me. But, I've started out. I'm not going to heed it. And I start going over here. And, hey, things are working out just a little bit. South wind comes up. I can do what I need to do now. They didn't really understand. That's kind of what we do sometimes. We forget the good advice that we've been given. We start going the opposite way. We start getting progress made toward our destination, not the destination where we need to go. But we see ultimately what the outcome is, and it's not a good outcome for anyone involved.
James?
Yes, Ms. South.
Why was the phrase used that says they weighed anchor instead of saying they raised the anchor?
You know what? It's not the type of word that I would use, right? I would maybe have to call a friend on that one and see what my specific dictionary would say in that regard.
Loosing fence.
Loosing fence. So it seems like you would be, pulling the anchor. I don't know why it would be represented in that way, though. Let me see. But Yeah, it was the one before what we were just looking at. If somebody else could look that up, maybe find the definition.
The New Living Translation says, when a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors stopped looking naked, so they pulled up anchor and sailed close to the shore of Crete.
And maybe it's the term "wait up" means just to pull up, and we're not sailors, so we don't use that word. Monty?
Weight anchor is a sailing term. It just means they took anchor.
They took the anchor up. Okay. I'm not a boater, obviously, so Monty's closer to it than I am. Okay, any other comments or questions before we go in? Okay, so they're going up. They think they have everything made. They have the south wind that's pushing them right towards where they need to go. But in verse 14 it says, "But before very long there rushed down from the land a mighty violent wind called a Uraqueo. And when the ship was caught in it, it could not face the wind, so we gave way to it and let ourselves be driven along, running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, where we were scarcely able to get up the ship's boat under control. After that, they hoisted it up. They used its supporting cables and undergirding the ship. And fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor, and in that way let themselves be driven along." So Uraqueo is a combination of two words, Euros, which is the east wind, and the Latin for Aqueo, which is the north wind. So in what we'd call it, it would be a nor'easter. So, and some people even compare these types of storms to hurricane-type storms. That's how large and violent they are. And in just a moment, they'll talk about facing the eye of the storm. So it could even be that violent of a storm that they're about to face, or that they're just starting to face here. So it's a pretty serious issue they've involved in. So the things that they do when you're in a ship, I think they noted here 3 things that they did. They took up the boat, and my assumption is, and I think it's agreed upon, that this is a boat that you pull behind, a lifeboat in a way, in case you need to park the main boat and you go to shore. So you would have this boat that you could use to travel on a water that's not as deep, and that could be used to save yourself while on the ship. So they'd take this boat that's behind them, because in a storm it could be crashing against the back of the boat or the sides of the boat and give damage. And so they pulled the boat up and in with them. Then they took and undergirded the boat. So they wrapped the cables around the boat and they tied them tight, and so that kind of constricted all of the hull of the boat and made it more sturdy, more strong, less ability to open and close, and so that gave them more actual strength to the boat to withstand the waves and things that they might come in contact with. And did I say 2 things? Run aground, let down the sea anchor. I thought they said here, I might be wrong, that they took down the mast, but they didn't do that here. So there's just 2 things that they did here. They let down the sea anchor later on to try to keep themselves in some way stationary, but it didn't work. And they could only do this, they couldn't do it normally where they were, but they were only able to do that because in just a moment we'll see where they are on a map. But there was a small island, that gave them some block against that northeastern wind. So Clauda was an island. At least they had a little bit of a chance to do things before they got really in trouble. And I think this is so here's the map again. Let me get down. Oh, I did it again. Sorry. I need to touch it with my pen. So here was where they were at Fair Havens. They wanted to make it over to Phoenix, which I think is about 75 miles, but they didn't make it far at all, right? As soon as they got that little south wind that was pushing them against the island of Crete, they started to lose it. And so they went down on the south side of Clauda. And we'll see in just a moment from here, they're going to go for a ride for a while out into the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. So that's where we are as of right now, is this little area right here. And we'll continue to read on. Verse 17. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, They began to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, from then on, all hope of us being saved was gradually abandoned. So really, they really are losing hope at this point. So they began to jettison the cargo. Why would you you have a lot of stuff in the boat, right? You have stuff to sell stuff. Why do you get rid of stuff in the boat? What's the use of that? Because you're crazy?
Sitting lower in the water, and when you get rid of some of that,
Weight.
raises it up, it gives a little bit more thing from the waves, but you still got to keep your buoyancy.
Right.
So,
You can't be too high up,
balance.
right?
Hmm?
You can't be too high up because then you'll tip over. But mostly it's to raise yourself up some because we'll see they're close to like lower spots around these islands, so they got to be careful. They're not going to run aground. They have no control over the boat. They could be pushed against an island, and they want to be as high as they can to get close enough to the island to do anything. Tom?
They also don't have the stars and things to guide. They don't know where
They
they're
don't
at.
know anything right now, right?
So they, yes and no. We could be close, we might not be.
Yeah.
They don't know. There's no way to tell them.
Right. They can still do sounding, but really they only know from their point of where they are right then. They don't know if they're going to be within land within a few minutes, right, at the storm. They can't see anything. Yes, Clayton?
I was reading, it sounds like a bad time of year to leave and try to make this trip, but I was reading there was food shortages in Rome during this period of time, and so the emperor would pay bonuses to any ships that could arrive during this bad weather with food.
Yeah. So you would think, why would that captain even want to venture out, right? He's crazy, right? But yeah, that's very likely, is he wanted to get there to unload the cargo, but if he gets paid bonus too, right? Money makes you do a lot of bad things sometimes, right? Irrational things. So that's a warning to us, right? We think, oh, well, if we can just work a little bit more, right? If we spend more time at work, I don't need to be with my family, or I can miss services, I can get more money. But we're waiting for a shipwreck in our own lives, right? We're going to get storm-tossed, and we're going to suffer all these things because of that desire for more. And we have to be careful with that. Good point, though. But we'll see this a lot. So the hope, there's hope of being saved, but it's gradually going away. We're losing hope constantly. And I'm a wimp when it comes to boating. I've gone onto a boat to go deep sea fishing once, right? And so I see land, we get away from land, we start moving away and away. I start hitting waves, and I mean, these waves are nothing, right? They're rocking me back and forth. It doesn't make me feel well. It's like, oh, I wish I could be back at land. This is nothing like what these people are suffering from, right? And they are storm-tossed. There's nothing to give you any hope at all. You don't know where land is. Even if land was there, you're probably going to crash into it and break apart. So I've also read a book recently of Robinson Crusoe. So it's about a man who his father tells him, don't go out, don't be a sailor. You can have a good life here. Just be satisfied with what you got. But he wants to go out and have excitement. But the very first time he goes out, he's in this horrible storm, and he's prays to God to save him, and then he tells his father he's sorry, but like a little bit of time after that, he forgets it, and he does it again, right? And finally, he gets a reputation that captains won't even have him on board because he's a bad luck omen. He's like, you're not listening to God. He's telling you something to do, and the storms at sea are such a horrible thing, and we need to see that as spiritually speaking. We need to be aware of the storms that are happening all around us and not get ourselves put into that situation. Okay, verse 21. When they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. So he says, you should have listened to me, right? I gave you advice you did not heed. But you need to keep courage For there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. And so he gives, this isn't his advice here, it's going to be a advice from, or specifics from God. In verse 23, for this very night an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me. So it's interesting, right? He belongs, he is his property, right? That's what he's saying here. I belong to him. He is my Lord. I submit to him in all ways, and that's the way we need to be. And in whom I serve stood before me. And we'll go on to read the next few verses. Verse 24 is saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe, God, that it will turn out exactly as I've been told. But we must run aground on a certain island. So God gives them a message, right? He says, believe in me, have faith in me, you're going to survive. They still have to do their part, right? They have to continue on. It's not going to be immediate, right? They're not going to be saved by the island, even though the ship is lost for a period of time. But he says, for I believe in God that it will turn out exactly as I've been told. That's faith, right? We have to have faith in what God has told. God has granted to us all that's sailing with us. God has granted us, right, a promise. And we have to believe in God what he's told us, that he'd keep his promise. Paul believed not only this promise, but all of God's promises, right? And even before this, God had been told that he's going to go to Rome, right? And throughout all of this, he never loses his confidence in God. We see that God continues to come to him and give him courage and give him his assurance that things are going to continue to happen. And God has continued to give us assurances, right? That things are going to happen the way he says it's going to happen. That his promises are going to be kept. And we're not going to get directly told through an angel, but God has given us, the encouragement that we need to continue on, to believe that things will turn out exactly as God had said, right? And he gives us that based upon his promises he's kept all throughout time, and that's the word he's given to us, that we can have assurance that he'll keep his promises. Paul had that assurance that God would keep his promise as well. Okay, any comments or questions so far? Yes, Monty.
I think it's interesting there toward the end of verse 24, it says, God has granted you all those that are saved. It's almost like God had given them to Paul as a gift or something along that line, the way it's phrased there even. Paul has stayed faithful, and because of that, and his good advice to him or whatever, he said, okay, I'm going to let you have these people stay alive. In order to preserve Paul, he was preserving them too.
Right, and God didn't have to do that, right? The only promise was that originally Paul had been promised to go to Rome. It wasn't a promise for all of these people, but he'd given them, they should be thankful to Paul because of his steadfastness, his faith in God, because it's because of him that they would ultimately come out of this well, if they heeded Paul's advice. We'll see in just a moment that there's more things that are happening, and if things happen in a different way, there'll be problems with the outcome. So there's still things that people have to do. Paul was going to make it to Rome. In order for all the other people to be saved, he needed to make sure that they were doing the right thing. And so going on to verse, how much time? Yeah. 27, but when the 14th night came, it's a long time to be at sea in a storm, it's 14 nights. As we were being driven about by the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. So they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. A little bit farther on they took soundings and found it to be 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might be run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. We're going to continue reading. But as for the sailors, they were trying to escape from the ship They let down the ship's boat into the sea, and on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men remain on the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved." And the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. So we see that they were doing the soundings, seeing how deep they were. They were gaining, they looks like land's coming because we're getting shallower and more shallow as we come on. So they threw out some anchors so they didn't run aground, right? The one thing with these big ships, that's why you had the smaller ships, is to get some people onto the smaller ships and go to land. And if you got too close with the big ships, you're either going to be stopped in a sandbar or run upon the rocks, and you could be destroyed from the waves if there was a tempest roaring at that time, and there was. But we see here that the sailors, these are the ones who knew what they were doing, right? They said, this Paul guy, I don't know that I believe him. We know how to do things, right? We're experts at this. Let's go ahead and pretend like we're doing something else, pretend like we're messing with the anchors. We're going to get in the ship and go, right? We're getting close to land. We think we can make it. But we see that Paul said, unless these men remain on the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. He didn't say, we won't be saved, because God had promised to him to get there, right? You, the other people that God had promised to be safe, if these men are doing something opposite what God had planned, you've got to make sure that they are stopped. And we see the influence that Paul had upon the commander. He ultimately just cut away the ropes, right? He says, you can't leave. I believe Paul. And they let it fall away. So the one hope of salvation, which the centurion could have taken himself. He had the ultimate control. He could have said, I'm going to get in that ship and I'm going to go. But he had enough faith in Paul saying, okay, he said these guys have to stay. I'm going to cut away the lifeboat, right? I'm going to cut away my ability to leave, at least my only known physical ability to leave, and trust Paul. That's a lot of confidence that Paul had, and that's what Monty was talking about earlier. He'd gained this confidence. He was an upstanding man. He had said things had come true. He was very well trusted at this point in time. Any comments before we move on? Tom?
Came from the confidence Paul had and his calmness in the time of, calamity.
Right.
Everybody else was starting to panic, but Paul, wasn't.
He wasn't.
He was keeping that, and he gave some advice that, it did make sense. They hadn't eaten for a while, so because of the storm. It wasn't because they didn't have food. It's just there was probably no way to prepare it.
Right. And we'll see the next few verses that talks about Paul. He wasn't running around crying or being hysterical or anything. He was saying he was only level-headed of the bunch. He says, look, if you believe what I've told you, you need to help yourself, right? Get some food. He's encouraging him to take some food. He says, you haven't been doing that. You need your strength. We're still going to have to do our part. We're going to have to swim or grab onto things. The ship's going to be lost. I've already told you that. So you're going to have to work to get to where you need to go. You need to eat. Take confidence in what I've told you. And he was a level head in the midst of that horrible situation. And he took food, and he took the bread. He gave thanks. He's still in a time of awful situation. There was a blessing there. He had food. Thinking about the book, Robinson Crusoe, a lot of those shipwrecked people didn't have any food, and they died of starvation. There was nothing there. They had food. They should be thankful for it, and Paul was thankful. He gave thanks to God for that little blessing of something to eat, and that he could gain some strength from that. And he broke it and began to eat, and we'll see, and just later on, that had an effect with all of those who were with him. He was encouraged. We were just there, weren't we? Let's go that way. All of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. All of us in the ship were 276 persons. And when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat in the sea. So we can have influence, right? A level-headed, faithful person can have influence on a lot of people. We see how many people were on that ship. 276 people were there. And they all ate. They were encouraged by Paul, his steadfastness, his level-headedness, and they ate. And so they were ready to start the work of actually getting home or getting safe somewhere. So they figured they were going towards somewhere that the land was coming towards them most likely, so they began to lighten the ship even more. That precious cargo, is that one or two? Two? Okay. The precious cargo wasn't precious anymore, right? That extra payment to the emperor, my life is worth more than a couple extra dollars. So they started to throw the wheat into the sea. Any comments or questions before we end? Thank you so much for your attention.
Teach me, Lord, to wait right down on my knees till your good time. You answer my pleas. Teach me how to rely on what others do, but to wait in prayer for an answer from you. Teach me, Lord, to wait while hearts are aflame. Let me humble my pride and call on your name. Keep my faith renewed, my eyes on you. Let me be on this earth what you want me to be. Those that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Teach me, Lord. Teach me, Lord,
So recently, I've been studying over the life of Abraham Lincoln. And one of the moments that really stuck out to me was on June 16th, 1858, when he went to the Illinois State House and famously said, "A house divided against itself will not stand." Now, we know that that's taken directly from the Bible. Turn with me now to Matthew 12, verse 25. And that is Matthew 12, verse 25. But Jesus knew their thoughts and said to them, "Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself will not stand." We see here that any kingdom, village, or house that is divided will fall. And so will we as Christians. If, as Christians, we become part of the world and we try to fit in with that, we can't fit into God's will. Turn with me now to Romans 12, verse 2. And that is Romans 12, verse 2. "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." As Christians, we are not supposed to be conformed to this world. We're supposed to be different, and we're not supposed to be someone who fits in. Turn with me now to 1 John 2, verse 15. Again, that's 1 John 2, verse 15. "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him." As Christians, we're not supposed to love the world. And if we love the world, the love of the Father is not in us. So, as we go into this week, let's live a life that is separate and apart from the world. There may be some of you here tonight who have not taken that last step of being separate and apart through baptism. Or it may be that you were separate and apart and you've let sin pull you away from God. Whatever your needs may be, please come to the front while we stand and sing.
There's no other way but this. I shall never decide the gates of life if the way of the cross I miss. The way of the cross leads home, leads home. The way of the cross leads home, leads home. It is sweet to know as I onward go.
It's good to see everyone tonight. Glad you're all able to be here. Let's remember our next service will be Sunday morning at 9:30 for Bible study. Let's remember the virtual Bible study tomorrow night at 8 o'clock also. It should be a good study. A couple of announcements. We need one more teacher, James tells me, and it needs to be a male teacher. You can check with him and see what class that is, and if you're able to help with that, we'd appreciate it. We have an announcement of arrangements that's been made for Linda Boatman's funeral. It's going to be a graveside service tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the Hopper Cemetery in Marshall County. Tomorrow at 2 at the Hopper Cemetery in Marshall County. That's all I have for tonight, so let's have our closing prayer.
Please bow. Dear God, Heavenly Father, how great and powerful you are. Thank you for this day you've given to us, and thank you for all the many blessings. And thank you for the ones who are fighting for our freedom, and please keep them safe, and please be with our leaders, and help them to make the right decisions, and please be with the ones who are sick, and the ones who have lost loved ones, and the ones who are traveling. And thank you for Jesus down across for our sins. In Jesus' name, amen.